Excellent. A pleasure to have Scott Masson with us, and many of you know. And Scott has been involved in the area of education. Interestingly, Scott left Canada to do his graduate studies in England as I don't know if a nominal Christian or just a non-believer. Christianity wasn't real to him. Scott had a conversion experience in his graduate studies. That's a whole very interesting story in itself. But engaged there with his own dissertation work, I guess, with a supervisor who was not, I guess, in any way sympathetic to Christian belief, but highly respected Scott sufficiently. And Scott got his dissertation done and a very good experience at Durham. But then Scott came back to Canada as a Christian and realized there were some serious disconnects going on in terms of what Christians claimed to believe and what was actually happening in the public square and how indeed education was being shaped and directed. We'll get Scott to speak more on that shortly. But Scott's, if you have a look, I did send a link with Scott's, a number of his YouTube videos. He's a excellent lecturer, a passionate lecturer, I say a passionate educator, with profound insight into much of our literary heritage. There's Scott. Okay, we're coming. And brings a deep sense of Christian worldview perspective that we really, as a culture, have really lost our moorings, lost our connection with our real roots, and are in sad shape as a result of that. And one of the key areas that this has to be corrected is in the area of education. And Scott has devoted much of his life work to doing education in a properly Christian manner. Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point. I'll keep an eye. We have a number of people dropping in as we go. But I think, let's say this is an opportunity for Scott to share some of the insights and concerns, I guess, he has around developing what we call a Christian ecosystem sufficient to really sustain the kind of Christian education that's needed at all levels.
Well,
Okay,
thanks,
Scott,
Don. Thank
over
you.
to you. Over
Yeah,
to you.
yeah. So thanks again for the introduction. Don has been trying to get me on one of these conversations for a while, and I'm not going to talk about something of academic expertise here today, so much as although I do think I have some expertise in the area I'm going to talk about, but more as an area of conversation, since this is called Inklings Conversations, about a matter about which everybody is aware now, which is basically the disintegration of Christendom and the destruction of education across the board. So much so that not only do Christians perceive it, but the whole world perceives how bad education has become. And it's sad to say that Christians, although they have been aware of the consequences of this for quite some time, insofar as they see what they call a hemorrhaging of faith. So the EFC, I have the ability to share screen, right, Don?
Yes, you do.
Okay, so give me a sec here. I'll see if
Yeah,
I can.
evangelical fellowship, yes.
Yes. The EFC, several years ago, this is back in 2012, produced a report called Hemorrhaging Faith, Why and When Canadian Young Adults Are Leaving, Staying, and Returning to the Church, in which they described a pattern so alarming that one would have thought there would be an immediate response on behalf of Christians, because they basically said that 70% of those that grew up in evangelical households left the faith by the time they reached university or left university, and they never came back. They're not coming back either. And a 70% attrition rate is catastrophic by any standard. I think only in baseball, if you hit 300, you're doing all right. You're a good player. But in terms of anything else, this is a catastrophic failure. If you get 30% in a school setting, you'll fail as well. But in terms of the responsibility set to parents to educate their children and the church to disciple all nations, including those within the church, in particular those in the church.
Yes.
This is something that needed to be attended to with great urgency. Instead, my observation is that precisely nothing happened in response to this, aside from two further reports from the EFC, the latest of which appeared last year, basically charting the same decline at a more accelerated rate, which is hardly surprising, given the lack of response to the original report.
Right.
Now, the original report was drafted because they already knew that the problem was there. They just wanted some sort of, I don't know, I guess they thought a report would motivate people to action. In my experience, reports do absolutely nothing, but sit on shelves and justify the think tanks that produce them, I guess, that they're doing something of value. And they probably do, because they give us objective indicators that something has gone wrong, but they don't actually motivate action. And I can tell you from experience in-house that the response to the crisis in education and Christian education within Christian institutions. So I'm a Tyndale University professor, I think Dawn said.
Correct. Did I? Yes, I
And
did.
I started a classical school in Toronto in 2014, Westminster Classical. And the community did not, quite frankly, I had very strong resistance within the Christian community in Toronto to the very idea of a Christian school in Toronto, for a wide variety of reasons that I won't get into here, because it's not my purpose to do anything of that sort here, but more to look at the big picture, because this is meant to be a big picture conversation. But what I noted here is that the families who were aware of the problems that Hemorrhaging Faith identified were very responsible in dealing with their own personal family responsibilities, and those were primarily the homeschoolers, who have grown by the year, I believe, since that time, probably before that time, and I suspect under COVID conditions went up yet further, and I suspect they will continue to grow. And it seems to me that the homeschooling community is exemplary in its seizing of responsibility for the task that the Lord has placed on parents, and on Christian parents in particular, to educate their kids. So that's great. I have not, however, seen a response from the churches on the topic of education. When I say churches, there are individual churches that have done so, but the church as a whole, as a matter of common purpose, has not really lent into the education field at all. As I say, here and there, a church will start a school like the one that started at Westminster Chapel, but it has not been embraced by denominations or coalitions of churches. There isn't an education coalition, the likes of which we have in the Gospel Coalition. And in general, that the general problem that I see across the board is that everybody has compartmentalized themselves into little silos of expertise, carefully, bureaucratically delineated guidelines about what they are to do and what they are not to do. And if they deviate from that, they think that literally the gospel is at stake. So in the church field, and I've worked as a pastor in a church, and strongly believe in the gospel, the substitutionary atonement of Christ, by faith, through grace. These things are bedrock foundational beliefs. However, in the Gospel Coalition, and I would call the narrowing of focus here, allegedly, and probably in many cases intentionally, to magnify the work of God in our midst, there is a refusal to look at the consequences of the gospel as they play out in terms of the kingdom of God. And that will include the discipling of nations. It will include the discipleship of children. It will include um, social welfare. It will include Christians' involvement in politics and law and all manner of areas of life. These things have been left to the side, or rather said, these are important things. They usually will say these are important things, but they're not the focus of the church. The church's focus is on the gospel, declaring the gospel, and we're not going to talk about what's happening in the field of education. We're not even going to talk about it. I've heard that said.
Yes.
And the reason for it is because of integrity. In our integrity, we will not talk about what is going on in the school system, even though we don't agree with what's going on, but we won't talk about it from the pulpit. From the politician's side, you go to the politicians, say, well, you talk about these issues because it's in the realm of the political sphere, because of course we have a public education system here that's responsible to the politicians, and the politicians push it back on the churches and say, you know, we don't want to involve ourselves in matters of morality and social um, uh, things that are divisive amongst Canadians. We want a common policy, but we don't want to lean into areas like the sex ed curriculum. They want to stay away from it by and large. They don't want to talk about religion in the school system, and they move progressively towards what we have in Quebec, which is a really a religiously hostile education system. And so on all sides, and in the Christian university, let's say here where I am at Tyndale, we will find that the Christian universities want to uphold their faith alongside their education, the academics, but they don't want to do in such a way that will suggest that a Christian view of education or of academia is at odds with the public view of in the state school system. They don't want to go against that. They don't want to stick their heads above the parapets. They don't want to challenge this, or let alone suggest that Christians have a place in rebuking the public school system. And so in each case, for whatever reasons, and sometimes the reasons are different, people are committed to sticking to their knitting and sticking to what they regard as their responsibility, and they're going to be very focused on it, and they're not going to talk about anything outside of it. And if you do talk outside of it, then you're going to be regarded as a troublemaker, or as somebody that is opposed to the mission of the organization, whether it's the church or the school or the university, and really doesn't belong in the university now, or the school or the church. Now, these things have happened in part because we are moving into an age where it's like the age of the prophets, insofar as the prophets are never establishment figures. They're always outside the establishment, because they're pushed out of the establishment. They can't survive in the establishment. The establishment won't have them. It won't tolerate that sort of truth at the center where the power is resides. They will not tolerate that sort of truth to be articulated. And so my initial aim as a convert was to get myself into a high level university like in Oxford or Durham, where I was from, and to do more or less what C.S. Lewis had done and J.R.R. Tolkien, and follow that that example. And this is where the that little, where is it here? Paradigm from Aaron Renn. Let's see if I can find this here and show it for you. I can find it. I have it. Where is it? I'm just no good at it. There it is. This transformation that was taking place, that as Renn described it, I had noticed this back when I converted. And when I converted, and I don't know if you can see my pointer here.
Yes.
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the positive world, right on the cusp, as he describes it. I mean, whether it's exactly when he puts it or not, I mean, that's almost irrelevant. It's to show where Christians lie in relation to society in general. Up until the 1968, the sexual revolution, Christians are part of the soft establishment. And in the period that I grew up in, I was born in 67 and onwards. Largely, the world was positive towards Christians. It was not. It was regarded as something that one did. You went to church, whether you were a believer or not. The mainline denominations were doing reasonably well in this period still. Evangelicals were tolerated and, in fact, gained considerable influence in the Reagan era in the United States and so forth. But that sort of sense of a positive relation towards Christians was waning over the course of time. And he connects it to an American context, which is fine, because I think it more or less holds across the board.
Right.
And there was a slow drift towards neutrality. Now, that again is the period when I converted, right there, right in that period.
Right.
And my thesis was effectively noting that what was understood as a neutral thing in our world was no such thing, that there were always presuppositions that underlay the various eras, and these presuppositions were not neutral. And what I observed is they were increasingly hostile towards Christians, and they were doing so in a very gradual way. And the cultural Marxist um, line of the long, slow march through the institutions could be observed in this.
Yeah.
And I could see that for myself. So when I converted, right in that period, let me get rid of this screen because it's distracting.
Yeah, it's
Um,
I'm going to
during
send
that,
a copy of that to everybody as well.
sure. Yeah, thanks, Don. During that period, the gay marriage debates were on the cards. So when I was at the University of Durham, in my own college, St. John's College, one of the lecturers, Michael Vasey, who was gay, wrote a book called Strangers and Friends. And he was advocating that scripture actually was less hostile towards same-sex relationships than had been understood historically, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a huge controversy within my college, because my college was a split seminary and academic institution. They were training ordinands for the Church of England there. So there was a big controversy, and I was brought right into it in year one of my Christian faith. And I could see that the trajectory of what he was talking about in the context of that training institution was much more strongly represented in the university. And that furthermore, that trajectory was growing and was going to grow increasingly year by year, because a man by the name of Michel Foucault was being read by everybody in the academy. In the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and onwards, he was the most cited public intellectual. Everyone was citing Foucault. And Foucault was a gay man, first public figure in France to die of AIDS in 1984. Used to be called GRIDS, by the way.
Yeah.
It was connected with a gay, I can't remember what GRIDS stands for now, but it was something, it was a gay disease that was called that. And then it got rebranded as AIDS, to be a little less pointed towards the group that was particularly afflicted by it.
Right.
But the academy was moving in this direction, and it wasn't only because of the same-sex issue that I was concerned. It was the whole worldview was shifting towards one in which Christian moral understandings would no longer be tolerated, because we were moving towards a sort of a monism, or an inclusivism, where every perspective, or if you prefer, a pantheism, where every perspective would be included, and good and evil would be a matter of perspective. But there was no absolute good, there was no absolute evil, and there was also no standards that would be upheld by the group as a whole,
Right.
without exception. So the family, for instance, was going to be under target. The Christian faith would also have to go. It would no longer, not only would it not be part of the establishment or regarded as positive, it would have to conform to an inclusivist worldview, or it would be destroyed. And it was then in the situation of, if it compromises, it will be destroyed. And if it resists, it will be destroyed. So that's the problem with pantheism. Either you will assimilate or you will be destroyed. Obviously, assimilation is not an option. However, that is exactly what was going on when I came to Canada.
Right.
I found that that was precisely what was happening. And it was largely because of a factor that I came to see very early on. I can't remember when I first saw this, but
Right.
it struck me so strongly that I held on to it. And I'm going to put this up here again. Oh, shoot, where is it? There it is. Let me put this up on the screen for you. It was a quote from Yuri Bezmenov,
Hmm.
Russian emigre,
Okay.
former KGB informant,
Right.
disinformation expert,
Yes.
defected to Canada, gave a whole bunch of lectures in the 1980s. I don't recall those. I was in university in the 80s, but I don't remember Yuri Bezmenov. He noted about the problem of education and of information that the real problem and the reason that people don't respond as they ought is not because they can't see the evidence, um, in the sense that the evidence is in front of them. They refuse to see it. They won't see it as much as you can, and that's because they're demoralized. So I'll just read what he has written here. Exposure
Yeah.
to true information does not matter anymore. A person
Yes.
who's demoralized is unable to assess true information. This is the effect of a disinformation campaign. The facts tell him nothing, even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents and pictures, he will refuse to believe it. And that's the tragedy of the situation of demoralization. And furthermore, and this is deeply
Yes.
troubling, once people's morals have been debased, education becomes indoctrination because education no longer will deal with matters of right and wrong.
Yes.
It won't do it. It refuses to do it. And the entertainment now has no moral component. It's just sort of what he calls a hypnotism. It's there to distract you, to
Yeah.
amuse you, but it isn't actually there to cultivate your mind or your soul in any way. And once that is also the case, then there's an inversion that takes place whereby those who are morally good become attacked and criminals become leaders. And finally, lies become the truth. Now, this
Right.
is Yuri Bezmenov. And this, in, in, in one fell swoop, explains what I think has been going on for decades in the
Yes.
Western world, literally decades. And it happened in earnest from the 1960s onwards in Canada. I think
Right.
it's been going on for a longer period than that. But there's been a demoralization as people have been coerced, co-opted, deceived, um, enticed into telling lies. And the problem with telling lies is that it corrupts people's integrity and it makes them so weak that they won't fight back and they won't hold their ground and they won't stand against falsehoods or even harms because
Right.
they'll convince themselves that their persecutors really mean well for them. And they develop something along the lines of what we'll call the Stockholm syndrome.
Right.
And that's what we're facing in Canada right now. And we can see it play out in the education system. We saw it play out under COVID as well. Exact same scenario where it was manifestly fraudulent what was being presented to us. And the measures to combat it were ridiculous by any standard. Anyone could see that what was going on was not as it was being presented. And the measures to fight it, like a cloth mask or these other masks, or standing 6 feet distance, or 3 feet if you're not in Canada, but 6 feet if you're in Canada.
Only in
And
Canada.
through masks, which I can tell you through um, because I used to be on culture wars programs on TV and radio and so forth, and was acquainted with these sorts of things that most people wouldn't be. But the nurses unions in Canada, in Ontario, had fought against having masks as a requirement for their practice twice in 2015, I think, 16, and again in 18. And the judge upheld the nurses' right not to wear masks because they could find no evidence whatsoever that masks um, were preventing infections. No evidence. So they were allowed. Now, these were rulings that took place right before COVID hit. And I was aware of this. And of course, everybody else would have been aware of it who had any knowledge of the field of healthcare.
Right.
And I mean, I'm not an expert in healthcare, but I was just aware that the cases had gone forward. And yet we were being told that we had to wear this. And if we didn't do it, that everyone was at risk, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't matter if you didn't have COVID. If you were healthy, you still had to wear a mask. And so it's obvious that the purpose of wearing the mask had a different purpose. And the purpose there is simply to terrify everyone. Constant terror, constant hypnotism, constant indoctrination, and it's a sort of propaganda assault.
Scott,
that's not the purpose of my conversation here today.
Yeah. Can you define demoralized? I somehow missed it.
Demoralization is when people have a sense of right and wrong, and they compromise on it in such a way that they lose a sense of their own moral self-worth. They feel like they're a failure. They can't forgive themselves for what they've done. And they're unwilling to stand against further compromises because they feel like they have no integrity. Like I know I did. So a great illustration is when somebody wants to go forward for an abortion. I've made this argument on the air, by the way.
Right.
When somebody when a woman gets pregnant and she's in distress because the situation was not such that she wanted to get pregnant. That was not her intention. And because the pressure in the Canadian context is extreme to allow her to have her choice, and it's become legal for several decades since the early 70s. People will not speak against it in general, but they will often even drive them to the clinics. Now, they don't actually commit the abortion themselves, but they are supportive to those who are in the position where they're going to go forward for it. Now, you might say, and the justification for doing this is that they care for the person concerned, and they genuinely feel her distress, and they want her to know that they're not judging her and they care for her. And that I think that's wholly legitimate, of course, those feelings. However, what they are doing is that they're aiding and abetting the murder of an unborn child. Now, if you do these little measures across the board, and you could still say the same thing about same-sex weddings, about family members expressing their same-sex attractions and dating and the gender identity and all that. And if you refuse to speak on any of these things, and you just because you perhaps think that it will affect nothing to say something other than upset the people concerned, and it will not dissuade them from acting, your moral integrity is being eroded very slowly. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about necessarily a huge Judas Iscariot moment where you betray the Lord, but rather there's small little compromises that are demoralizing so that people's moral integrity has been so compromised that they can't push back against what they see plainly is going on in front of them. And eventually they lose the capacity to even see it. And if you point it out to them, they will refuse to accept it. That's what I mean. Does that make sense? Would people tend to agree with me that that's what's happening? I actually don't care if people do agree with me.
That's good. But I mean, the history certainly of the Soviet Union in the 30s and on, that happened. We see it again in China. We see it in Venezuela. Wherever there is a communist state, this process is where, of course, Eastern Europeans are very much attuned to this.
Very much attuned to it. Yeah. And so one of the things, sorry to interrupt, Don, that's one of the things I noted as a college and careers pastor. And when I worked at Westminster Chapel and I wrote against the sex ed curriculum, the people that came and wrote me were from China and from Eastern Europe.
Right.
And they were strongly supportive. And they said, I cannot believe that other people can't see this. And these were people from former communist countries, and they could all see what was happening. They could see that Canada was like a communist country. but the
Yes.
Canadians would not believe it, could not believe it, and were incredulous at the very idea that they were acting like communists were, because after all, they're just nice Canadians, and
Yeah.
they have never thrown anyone into the gulag. They have never um, betrayed somebody the way you'd see in the Stasi in Eastern Europe and so forth. They have never done such things. They wouldn't do such things. Well, now I think since COVID, we can say that those sorts of things are happening,
Yeah.
and it's a slow process. Okay, so there's the slow descent into the current state of affairs. How do we remedy it? That's what the purpose of this conversation is, by the
Yes.
way. Let me just push this,
Yeah.
because
And you
this
might say,
camera blinks out at every half hour, and I don't want it
okay,
to go to a rainbow screen
right, you know, counterproductive then. But
slightly.
Rod Dreher talks about soft totalitarianism in terms of what we're experiencing with the really causing people to fearful speaking the truth and being compromised, as you've said, over time.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that's what's going on, and therefore he encourages us to tell no lies, and
Right.
for the exact same reason of demoralization. When you lie, you act against your own conscience and against your own soul, and it destroys your integrity going forward. Do not lie.
Yeah.
I think it's very important. My mother taught me this at a very early age, and for some reason I believed her, that it was the
Yeah.
for some reason, as I say, I was brought up in a Christian home, but it was a very nominal in my case for sure. I thought the importance of telling the truth was utmost, and would not lie. And I was praised for it. I suffered for it as well, but I in all of that I thought it was a good thing and a right thing. And I think it's in the age of demoralization, it's even more particularly important. So what does that have to do with an educational ecosystem response?
Yeah.
I said at the beginning that the people that have most clearly and responsibly acted in the wake of this grand uh, descent into barbarism, cultural barbarism, and immoral conduct are the homeschoolers. They've pulled their kids out of the public education system. They are very careful about the material that their children consume. They often don't have televisions because they can't control what's going on there. They may not even have internet, or if they do, then they regulate it carefully. There are various ways of doing this, but it's a very responsible movement. And I stand with the homeschoolers for that reason. I think these are people that are clear-sighted and they care for their children. I'm not saying that those that don't do this don't care either, but they're not acting very, they're not seeing what's right in front of their eyes, and they refuse to see it. And I've talked to them, and it is the Yuri Bezmenov situation. They've so compromised with the world that they won't believe it no matter how much proof you give them. And I can give them reams of proof, and I can give them expert testimony, and I can show them why and how it has happened, and they won't do anything about it. But for those of us who will, and the number does increase, and I noticed under COVID, a lot of people were shocked into alertness. One of the few benefits of COVID was that people were traumatized enough that they were sort of the spell was broken, that the government was their friend and was looking after them and looking out for them and so forth. But the problem with with the homeschooling community is that you can't, as a parent, and I have two children in the school age now, primary, both in primary, one about to enter secondary, is that you can't get them to the end of the process. You have to rely on experts at some point. At some point, you have to pass them over. And some parents are really capable and are able to get them through the high school phase. And that's rather extraordinary if they can, because for most parents, it's beyond their abilities to school them in both the maths and sciences as well as the arts. And they'll usually compromise on one or the other, and they simply don't care because they probably don't even care about the arts, let's say. And they're very good at the sciences and technology and so forth, and capable, and that they regard it as most important anyway, because those are the hard realms of knowledge. Even if you do that, you are forced at some point to hand them over to somebody else. And here we have the problem of in terms of the establishment of the process that I just described earlier, of the demoralization and the long, slow march of the left, which is the capture of not just institutions, but regulatory agency. Regulatory capture is a real thing now. Not just the government, not just parties. It's not just the NDP and it's not just the Liberals. And even if the Conservative government is opposed to this, which I'm not sure that they are, but if they are, the regulatory agencies that fall underneath them that will give accreditation to schools, to degrees, to programs, the Law Society, the theological institutions that will ordain priests, the everyone that wears robes, actually, the Levitical professions is actually it. And you'll notice that those that wear robes, academics wear robes, priests wear robes, pastors in some denominations anyway wear robes, lawyers wear robes, doctors wear robes. These are all Levitical professions. The Levitical professions are there, and if they have integrity and they uphold moral considerations, what is right and what is wrong in their areas, and they will not allow anyone outside of their area to interfere with what's right and wrong. So the lawyers are going to say to the government, this is a matter of the law, and you will not move out of your lane. Your lane is politics. Do not involve yourselves in the law. You're not above the law.
Right.
And the medical field, furthermore, will say this is about health, and it's not about politics. It's not about any other things. You stay out of our field. We will look after what is this. If they will do those things, then they maintain their integrity. But they don't. Not only do they not do those things now, they are absolutely captured by the same cultural Marxism that I described at the outset. And so the problem for those of us who have Christian children, as Christian parents who want to do well by our kids, is that the regulatory capture means that we have control, although even there we're trying to keep them out, but we have control insofar as when they're young enough. But once they reach the stage of maturity where they leave the home to go to university, to school, to start training for professions, they are brought under the influence of agencies that are working for captured regulatory bodies. And in order to get their certification, they are going to have to compromise. They're going to have to be silent about certain things. They're going to not express their integrity as forthright Christians. They're not going to be salt and light. They can't be, because they will lose their jobs. They won't get their jobs. They will never get into the professions without the regulatory stamp of approval upon them. And the regulatory stamp of approval now will include always an agreement with climate change and the LGBT agenda, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the reality of the situation, as far as I see it. And if you don't think it's entirely there now, I think everyone can see, based on the trajectory of the way things have been happening, that it is going to be that way very, very, very soon. And so the ecosystem approach is meant to do what I think is a more robust view of education than the one that we have come to accept over the course of our lives, which is that an educated individual is somebody that is in a profession and is a master of that profession at that point. And that person, who I think is the role model of this, is none other than Jesus himself.
Right.
We don't know anything about Jesus, or barely anything, between the time of his birth and the age of 2. and the age of 30. Other than that, he had a bar mitzvah and he read from the scroll. He was effectively being announced as a member of the local synagogue, and he read from the scroll as if he were an adult, and he was considered an adult. But then he disappears from view for 18 years, and we meet him again when he's a master carpenter, and he goes forth teaching and preaching. And then we know a lot about the next 3 years. We have his teaching ministry, and we, of course, have the account of his death and resurrection and so forth. But in between, what we had up until that point is a model, I think, of an educated individual, where at that point, the parents are no longer responsible. He's responsible for himself, and he's 30. Now, I don't want to stick too much on the age of 30, but more on what he had attained by the age of 30. And what he had attained is mastery of his profession and an ability to look after a family at that point. Now, he obviously didn't have that. I don't think then it was necessary for him to have that. You can be considered a responsible adult and mature in every way at that age without being married, but he would be capable of doing that. That sort of timeline needs to be considered as far as education goes from an educational ecosystem perspective. So what that means is that we no longer can only think about having a Christian primary school or a Christian secondary school or a Christian university. We also have to consider Christian employers and Christian regulatory agencies for those employers that will use Christian criteria of excellence. And the Christian criteria are not faith specific necessarily, but they will insist on a Christian moral framework with respect to truth and lying, with respect to our view of life, etc. And so that's my encouragement, is to try and reason together in not on a national level, but on a local level, to build small ecosystems of integrity so that our children can be raised so that they will retain their faith, not hemorrhage it, but retain their faith. And it's parents' responsibility that they do. And that responsibility doesn't end, by the way, when they go to university. So if you send your kids to a university and they lose their faith, I think it's still on the parents. I don't see any caveat there. Like, they're an adult, well, they no longer live at home, so therefore, so what do they have to stay at home then? And you're not responsible. I think you're responsible until they probably reach the age where they're in their profession. So we need to take that seriously and think about the responsibility and how we will make it so that Christian employers can have Christian employees that are equipped to serve under their in their companies and do them good service, do them honest work. And if we can do that, not only will we retain people in the faith community, we will also, I think, build better businesses and stronger families, and that will provide a witness to the community around us. And there will be hostility, but it will be a witness that will be attractive in a way that Christians have not been for a very, very long time, because of cultural Marxism. Anyway, that's the spiel. Let me hand it over to you, Don, and I'd love to hear what people have to say.
Yeah, excellent. Many important points. I think, and seeing the big picture and seeing it as a whole is really important. I want to open it up now for others to comment. I will just say, make sure if I don't have your email, you do put it in the chat. There are some good chat notes happening as we continue with this discussion, and I'll make sure to send the chat notes to everyone. So I think there's a few, but I don't have your email. Please do put it in the chat. And just finally, in terms of Scott's presentation, the book by Aaron Renn does go precisely into the areas that Scott has talked about in terms of developing this broader ecosystem that includes all areas of life. And I think that is well worth purchasing. And it's really just a discussion starter, but it's an important one to think really in the terms of this concept of an ecosystem and the fact that we really need. He talks about Christians really needing mastery and excellence in their areas of study or profession. And yes, we need each other as a body much more, I think, than we realize at this
Yeah,
point.
I hadn't read his book, Don, but I saw the general
Exactly.
sketch,
Yeah.
and I thought, yes, this is you're exactly right. And even if we can, even if that's all we get out of that, I think it's sufficient. We don't live in
Exactly.
the same, we can't operate in the same way that we did faithfully 20 years ago because the
Yeah.
context is very different.
No, exactly. Well, let me thank you, Scott, for an excellent presentation, and really moved us through a lot of very important terrain that we need to really assess and evaluate in terms of where we're at. Let me put it open to those of you that have been just listening, taking this in, and I'll just welcome questions to Scott or comments to the group as a whole. You can just put your hand up or
Speak.
indeed. And not all at once. So
Okay,
Ken, yes,
sorry.
Ken Stauffer, yes, please.
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott. That was a lot of great insights there. And one of the things, of course, some of you know I work for the Christian Heritage Party,
Yeah,
and I'm working away at trying to help the Christian Heritage Party look at some new approaches to things and so forth. And we're slowly making a little bit of progress there.
right.
But one of the one of the things the Christian Heritage Party has struggled with sounds an awful lot similar to what you described as the problem of Christians having to do with looking at a classical Christian education or a homeschool education. The resistance to it sounds very similar to the resistance at the Christian Heritage Party. It sounds similar to the kind of argumentation that the Christian Heritage Party gets with why Christians don't want to get involved in supporting a Christian political party. So anyway, I just found that parallel interesting.
Yeah, I think there is a parallel there. My sense of the importance of this particular topic, education, is that it seems like a scriptural emphasis to me to place the emphasis on those that are the weakest and the least capable, and it shows our commitment to the future and to those to some degree to things that are going to be a matter of faith in God by focusing on something that seems so insignificant as somebody who is incapable of defending him or herself for 30 years in a robust fashion. This is a very counterintuitive move to focus on education, but it is exactly the focus of the Christian faith, in my opinion. Christians have always thrown themselves into education, into health, into welfare, but education in particular. And the university is a Christian institution. It did not exist in the ancient world. Education existed, but it was transformed by Christians, and the emphasis was no longer on strength. It was on the image of God and children bearing the image of God, and it was extended not only to men but to women, because women also bore the image of God. So education is not just any old field. I think it is the field. Politics will, as everyone says, politics is downstream from culture. There is a need for Christians in politics and for Christian politics, but it is not the first front or the most important one. It will be the last front. And at that point, we'll have entrenched victories that were unseen for 30 years. This is the beachhead, is what I'm saying. This is the beachhead. And then 30 years from now, we may see a very different situation. But for now, I think it's going to be a very quiet and very patient and very fastidious and to some degree unrecognized work of God. But I think that there will be fruits to be seen down the road.
So, Scott, I have a couple. First of all, I want to say, wow, what you presented is so insightful. Wow. I have a couple of thoughts. I'm part of CUMP's community learning centers, and we have found that we can get parents fairly interested in it's Christian schools, getting the church to be educating their children within the school. First thing I kind of have come to, and I'm trying to convince the board, Compass, to take
Right.
this approach, is that the first thing that we probably should do in the first step to reach pastors is to convince them that the church has a responsibility to educate their children, disciple their children, and to help the parents disciple their children and protect the children from indoctrination in the schools. Now we of course want more than that. We want the pastors to feel like we're to be spreading God's kingdom when we're supposed to be an influence to the world around it.
Right.
But pastors, most of them, it seems like, don't believe that we should have any concern at all for being an influence to the culture around us. So sort of what I'm trying to get our group to realize is that we got to start with the low-hanging fruit, that
Right.
first of all, get the pastors to realize that we really do have a responsibility for our own children, and that we are losing them. And in order to stop losing them, we need to be helping the parents and the church protect the kids and disciple them. So that, like, the other thing that kind of comes to my mind is that I think of what Nick Ellis is doing.
Right.
He is providing education that is less expensive for those Christian families. Now, it's not convincing those Christian families that public education is a bad thing. They're kind of, maybe it's impossible to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
But just give them something that's convenient and cheaper. And maybe we should be trying to think in those terms, not just with the college level, but also with other levels, finding ways to grab them and get them interested, because this is so much more convenient and so much easier and less expensive, or something like that. Your response?
So my response is that what you're encountering with pastors is regulatory capture. And when I say regulatory capture, it's more of a mindset thing here than
Right.
It is actually a regulatory body, because there are no regulatory bodies per se. Although in a denominational college, there might be regulatory capture, that the church's boards or bodies that govern their institutions might be captured. But usually it's more of a mindset. And the mindset is there are two kingdoms, and the kingdom of this world is not of interest to Christians. We're preaching the kingdom of God, and that's not of this world. And therefore, the gospel will point people to the second coming of Christ and ignore the first coming and what was said in the first coming. So it's a regulatory capture of a different sort that preaches a kingdom that has not yet come. And preparing them for that, but not preparing them for this kingdom at all. And that is a serious problem.
Yeah, it's very defective.
It's a very defective view of what is said in Christianity, and it's a very late developing thing. And I haven't addressed that, and I didn't even want to address it per se, although it obviously has to be addressed, because the churches are our greatest failure on this front. Historically, the churches were the started schools. And I'll tell you, and you probably know this, George. In fact, I know that you know this. In overseas mission field, the first thing that missionaries will do is they, after they start a local place of worship of some sort where they can meet, they start up a school. And the reason that they do that is that it's clear to anybody that converts to the Christian faith that their children are lost to them unless they're also educated in the same thing. So they need to have a school, and it's a way of witness and outreach. Again, because of the demoralization of Canadians, and the idea, even to this day, among especially older Christians, but even among some younger, that we're a Christian country. They just cannot believe that the agencies that we call schools are anything other than indoctrination centers, but they are that. That's what they are. That's all they do. They don't, they not only they indoctrinate the kids in such a way that they're unable to do anything in life. They can't do math. They can't actually write. They can't spell, like it's terrible. Even on the just the competence level, I would not allow people to put their kids in schools. But churches need to come on board with that and come alongside. I think the younger generation of pastors will do so because they've been through the schools, they see it for themselves, and they're much in my experience from speaking to the 30-year-olds that are in churches, they say to me they will not put their kids in a public school. They will not.
Oh,
it's very
really?
encouraging. Yes, they will not. And so they usually lack alternatives, so they're going to commit themselves to homeschooling. And that's good. Oh man, this is great. However, some of them can't afford to go that route because of the high cost of living, etc. And that's where the church needs to step in then. And I think that, again, there's a place to be played. The whole body of believers can support those that are in the position of having, and the cost of having to look after the next generation of believers. That's why there needs to be Christian schools, because some people, guess what? They lose their husband or their wife. They're single parents. Are they going to be able to homeschool? Of course they're not. Is it not the church's responsibility to support them in their God-given mandate to educate that child? You bet it is. Well, so how are they going to do it then? They have no choice at the moment but to put them in a public school. Homeschooling is also not an option. So homeschooling is fine from in a certain context, in a certain age, under certain conditions. And I think those conditions were valid and they remain valid in some ways. But from the big picture, if you want to retain the faith and pass it on, it is not a winning strategy. It is not a dominion strategy. It's not a kingdom strategy, and it never has been. It never has been. It's a late developing, emergent awareness of responsibility on behalf of some very admirable people that will not last. It will not last.
So
they're divided and they will be conquered.
What will not last?
The
homeschooling movement. They are divided and they will be conquered. They're not. They don't. You can't perpetuate this if the grounds of preserving families is being eroded, and even the definition of the family has been rewritten in family law like it has in Ontario. The very unit of family has been written out of family law in Ontario. How long can a homeschool last if a home isn't there? Can't.
So that's what
here.
my question
Christina's had her hand up. Sorry.
Okay, Christy, and then Eddie. Yes, Christina, welcome. I know you've had a lot of experience in these areas.
Well, that's where my question was going when you were starting to kind of formulate your response to George's question there, Scott. And it was like, okay, this is interesting. So what do you, because there's so much resistance with the churches to get into, and for instance, I can say like the political aspect. So when we asked the churches to get involved, it was, in all fairness, it was during the municipal elections. And so, we asked them to do some parent group info nights. Has nothing to do with getting a seat at the table, only to have parents be aware and make an informed decision with their vote. And so, although we knew the intention and there wasn't any ill intent or, just self-malice in just trying to get into a spot, it had everything to do with our families and the parents and being aware of their informed decision. And if they want the indoctrination centers, this is who you vote for. But if you don't want the indoctrination centers, then this is who you need to vote for. And there was so much resistance. And then, so anyhow, once the election was done, we're like, okay, well, there shouldn't be any resistance now, because this isn't about getting a seat at the table. This is about the work that we're doing to inform parents of what's going on with our schools and our children. And still, there was still hesitancy. So it wasn't until this very last, it was November when we were planning the event in January but even with that, I had some awareness, is this realization that it's still that the churches are hesitant to make aware to the parents what's going on, because they were fine with us doing more of the, here are the options. If you want to get out of the school, the publicly funded school systems, then here are some options for you: homeschooling pods, homeschooling co-ops, private schools, and all of those things. But once they knew that we were also going to talk a little bit about the problems before we got into the solutions, there was some hesitancy there. And even now, like even trying to find a space for the second part of this, like we're going to hone in on homeschooling and pods.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are the churches wanting? Like, do they want everyone to pull their kids out? And now, while you were finishing your thought, you were saying it's not a sustainable way. It's not that's not the kingdom, how it should be. And so that's where my question was coming in. Like, I'm trying to take action in the way that God wants me to take action. I don't care if it's, it doesn't, my ego is not harmed by whether or not we, bring down the school boards or bring up another system or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't matter. All I want is a high quality education for my children, and not only for my children, but for all children. And the homeschooling bit, like a lot of us can take our kids out. We could take our kids out, but then it's not. Now, there's two parts to that, because when we take our kids out, that takes funding away from the schools, which puts them in pressure to make changes. If they're going to stop listening, if they're not going to listen to us, if they're not going to start listening to us, then it's going to unravel, and more kids are going to pull their kids. More parents are going to pull their kids out. They won't have the funding, right, to run their indoctrination centers.
Yes.
But then it's, there, even right now, there are kids that can't, or families, as you say, they can't or won't, they don't feel like they have the capacity to. And also, there's also the whole element of those who do take their kids out, whether it's sacrificial for them, like they're making a lot of sacrifice to take their kids out and homeschool or to put them into private schools. They're usually getting what they need at home to combat the indoctrination, right? And so it's these children that don't get all of this education and this moral teaching and moral understanding and understanding of walking with Jesus, and that they're going to be impacted the most with the indoctrination centers. And that's where I feel is that pull to continue to do this work that we're doing. But I don't know, Scott, like, what do you think? Like, what do you think the churches want? You think they want us pulling all our kids out? Is it just to create the pressure and it's not a sustainable way, and they know that? Do they want the publicly funded school systems to dismantle and us to rebuild? Like, what is it that they want? What will they support?
Churches?
If I can jump in here for just a second.
Yes.
Jake Swart from Oak
Jake. Yes, Jake.
If I put myself in a pastor's seat, or think of where pastors are coming from, I think often they view short-term, don't rock the boat, more important than long-term, let's retain the next generation. So they don't ever think of it that way, but in essence, they're willing to sacrifice the next generation to not rock the boat, not create waves in the short term. It's just messy for a pastor to have to deal with these issues in a very real way. So it's easier just to keep the status quo. And I really think that's what's driving a lot of pastors. Another question I've asked myself, and say I ask myself this from the perspective of church leadership. Somebody comes in and says, we're losing our children. And then how am I going to answer that? And if I wear my church leadership, my pastor's hat, I'm going to answer that question from that perspective. I need to create a program to alleviate this problem, where if we actually look at what's really important, the most important thing for children growing up for good outcomes is a relationship with their parents. So the child needs a relationship with mom and child needs relationship with dad. And education really is, we shouldn't really focus on the topic of education so much as focus on the topic of relationship. Education is going to happen. Children are going to learn regardless. They ideally learn from those that they have a really close, strong relationship with. And homeschooling just happens to give parents a lot of time to develop that relationship with their children, which is one reason it's so effective. But, focus on the relationship, and the children are going to learn. Each family is going to be different. So one family is going to focus more on the hard sciences. One is going to focus more on the arts. And that's okay. God made us all differently. And, having a broad overview of everything is good. But yeah, we all focus in our later life, and focusing in education is fine too.
Okay. I know
Yeah.
that Eddie, I'll let you, Scott, maybe respond. I know Eddie has his hand up here as well.
Yeah, I'll get to Eddie as well. So let me,
Go
Christine,
ahead.
where are you coming from exactly? I don't mean location, but your institution or?
I am in the sunny
Oh,
south of the
sorry.
United States, a place called Memphis, Tennessee. And I was
Oh,
intrigued by Dr. Masson's comments about the future, because I've been involved with homeschooling since 1970 here
right.
in Tennessee. And I was a lawyer before I retired, and a politician, recovering politician.
Right.
And,
For
and
sure. Yeah.
I think the experiences we've had, I understand the USA is a wild, wild west, so it may not be applicable at all to Canada, but at least we share the language and the heritage. And what I think has been really remarkable in the years that I've watched this is that the Christian community since 1970 has developed an entire substructure that the progressives in our nation have only become aware of in about the last 10 years. And to their intense horror, they see, and you're beginning to see in our press, great pushback, that it is possible for a child to be educated from kindergarten through graduate school and to have Sherpas in the graduate professions who will see to it that they are not punished because of their views. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a series of institutions that have arisen, and to the argument and concern, legitimate, that single moms, single dads don't have, especially if they're in low income, don't have the resources necessary to leave the public school system. I would offer to you just one possible counter to that to think about. There is a church in Mississippi, north of Mississippi, which is viewed as being the most backward state in the United States by those who don't understand what is happening in Mississippi,
Right.
where there are 100 students coming to a Associate Reformed Presbyterian church once a week, 50 of whom are Black. And for those of y'all who do not know, Memphis is the poorest large city in the United States. Overwhelming majority of Black folks are our citizens. 50 of the 100 are Black in the homeschooling. And a very significant portion of those, a plurality at least, are single moms.
Right.
And so what the church has been able to do in pooling resources is to find people to teach at the church one day a week things like chemistry and mathematics, algebra, calculus, whatever. So and the final thing I would say is it's not easily apparent, and there certainly is a lot of attempts to push back against what happened in our country with regard to the reversal of the infamous Roe v. Wade decision this past year. But what actually happened is there is an enterprise called the Federalist Society that was founded in the middle 70s that was responsible for the tutelage and the curation of the three justices on our Supreme Court who made that possible.
Right.
It's been a long, slow gestation process. Same as happening in the medical professions. So it's true that the Leviathan attempts to eat everything in its path, but it's been our experience, or at least my experience over the last 40, 50 years, that it is possible, even in a place as pagan, the current United States, for the church to be salt and light in even the other institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
I think we ought to have you back for to learn more. And Scott, I'll patch over. Christina's in the Waterloo area.
Okay.
And there's a lot going on. I know that the Jacob or Ream around at
Rayom. Yeah.
Rayom Bible. There's one church that's really embraced, I think, a big part of this picture in terms
Yes,
of
it has. Yeah.
So there's a hopeful sign. And Christina, perhaps, I mean, you're involved in there, and of course David Haskell's there in that area as well. So there is something happening in
We do
Waterloo.
have some churches that have been quite instrumental, for sure. Yes. In terms of just overall, though, and speaking to our own congregations, like there's a lot of hesitancy still.
And I guess one question I'll put to you, Scott, what's really, do you think, the best strategy to overcome this hesitancy, which has been quite widespread, obviously, and a common factor in terms of getting traction with the initiatives that you've mentioned? What really is your wisdom as to overcoming that hesitancy?
I wish I knew what the issue would be. That would I think they've been demoralized.
Right.
I think they're not being taught that it's their responsibility in churches to educate their children. I don't think I don't hear sermons on it. When was the last time you heard it? Maybe it has been in your church, but many churches will not teach Ephesians 6:3 and 4. They won't teach it in the context of Deuteronomy 6. They won't teach it in the context of basically what the whole of Scripture talks about in terms of the discipleship of the young. That it's just not a topic of conversation, and because of that, people feel out of their depth. If they're single parents, they not only feel out of their depth in terms of just being able to educate, they feel that they're so overwhelmed with responsibilities they can't even contemplate doing anything other than passing on their kids for someone else to educate. And then they run into the problem of the cost of education. So it needs to be all, I don't think there's any one point that needs to be addressed. They all need to be addressed simultaneously. And that's the point of the ecosystem, is to say each of these areas, the churches, the parents, the employers, the regulatory agencies, the trades, they need to be involved in this whole process, and they have to work together so that they can pass on, and we can get what we're seeing in the United States, where we have a federalist society that's able to create judges. And that's not a quick process. That's a decades long process. Canada, we have had our pants down for so long that we're not even remotely close to this. A few churches, we cite them, and okay, great, and I thank God for them, but it needs to be a much larger movement. And even in those areas where they are seizing the responsibility, are they then thinking we need to create something like the Federalist Society? Because we're going to need Christians who are able to think in the legal realm and be able to provide means for them to operate and hold on to their licenses and be given credibility. Are we thinking about the medical professions? Because at the moment, they're going to be required to commit abortions and euthanasia, or they're going to lose their license and they'll have to get. So how are we going to create a future where we can have Christians in those fields, and we want them in those fields because those are Christian fields? Health, welfare, education, they Christians, they created those fields. We have to be in those fields, or it is a culture of death as it is right now. and much more resolutely so going forward. You must do that. Well, then how do you think down the road so that the current state is not going to be much worse down the road? At present, it's only bad. It's what's bad is only worse going forward. That's the
Very
thing.
much.
There is no choice. And I say it, and I don't have many people here. If people will not embrace the idea of changing the channel on this, the church in Canada is going to die.
Yeah.
It's this close.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, it's Jonathan Wellham here.
Hey, Jonathan.
Thank you for the presentation. And of course, I'm coming at it from a couple of different perspectives, also as a business person in the financial community. But so I appreciate your comments. I think in terms of ways forward, I mean, some ideas. I mean, first of all, get behind the men and the pastors and the churches who are progressing and making the right moves. First of all, we need to get behind those people. And there are some of those people. We need to embarrass and shame some of the other pastors who are sitting on their hands and doing nothing. So there are a number of quite a few Christian schools are being built, and a lot of them are hybrid kind of models where you can do a little bit of homeschooling and Christian school, similar to what Aaron Rock's doing down in Windsor at the Harvest Church.
Right.
I think let's get behind the right people who are making the right decisions, and shame and embarrass these other pastors who are sitting on their hands and doing nothing in this area and not encouraging their congregations to get behind the homeschooling and there's Christian schools, classical schools, and so forth. That's important. I think also in some of the churches, I was just at a conference recently called To Build in Peterborough, and that was very well done. Again, it's how do we rebuild and build these institutions? And so at least just having the conversation, getting things going. I think again, Jacob Reum up in Trinity Bible is attempting to put together a pastoral training center. Our seminaries have let us down. They're not engaged in the culture. So again, his attempt there is going to be, how do you get pastors thinking in a worldview perspective? How do we get more men to get behind pulpits so we can start more churches? And so I think, my view, I think there are lots of things going on, good things, and progressing in the right area. And I think let's put our resources behind the people who are making these changes, and then start building. And I think other people, hopefully we pray that they will come alongside and see the urgency of the hour, that you cannot possibly put your child in Ontario in a public school system. I mean, it's just immoral at this point, and up until the university level at any rate. And so I think there are those good things in terms of business. I mean, I know at Aaron Rock's, the church, he's got a large church there in Windsor. He's now connecting businesses within the church. He said that 5-6 years ago, he would never even have thought of this. But now they've got an app in the church where plumbers and electricians and people in different areas, who they are in the church, and you start going to those people. You support other Christians in business. I think that's another great thing to do, again, building the businesses and the wealth creation, the way that you actually fund this. I know in my own investment business, we're all Christians. I only hire Christians, and we have a lot of Christian clients, and we're very thankful for. And that's something that, again, I can provide an opportunity for top students and graduates from universities that could not express their Christian views in the financial world anymore. I mean, you cannot be a CEO or in the C-suite of any company in Canada, any major corporation trading on the TSX, and speak out. And so that persecution is already there. So I think, again, within the churches, we need to have networks like the Public Square in the US, where people can start to work with and hire other Christians. We just changed our CRM, our client relationship management system, from a Silicon Valley company to a Christian company in the States that we can support them. So I think all of these things are coming together. I think we need to really promote them, get behind the people who are leading the charge, support them, and then just pray that other pastors who are, again, you wonder what world they're living in, get on board and start to preach the gospel in a holistic way, and away we go. So there's some ideas, anyways. But thank you very much. I appreciate your thoughts, and the urgency of the hour is very, very important, to say the least.
No, excellent points, Jonathan, as well.
Very good.
I think finding each other out and developing is, Scott has said, the ecosystem, which includes all these elements. And
Yeah, to be honest, I like the idea, although it's challenging for some of us, but just
right,
leaving the churches that are being derelict in their duties here for churches that are
right,
following the following God in all of the areas of life that are needed here. Maybe
yeah,
that's what needs to happen. It's sort of like a supply and demand, or it's a free market system.
yeah,
We're going to go where God is being worshipped aright, and we're going to leave the places that they're
that,
they're committed. Basically, the churches that are not willing to address the education issue at all are churches that are not going to be around in 20 years' time.
yeah, certainly. And there are, yes, quite a few comments in the chat. I will share that with you following the session.
Let me say this. I was asked about, or somebody mentioned Christian
Right.
Halls International. I'll put this up here.
Yes,
And you may want Dawn to have Nick Ellis on here
I think
in
so.
days ahead.
Yeah,
But Christian Halls International is an international organization that operates in Brazil and in East Africa and in the United States right now.
yeah,
And it's pushing into Canada with I introduced them to
right.
Jacob's
Okay,
school, and they're also out with the Compass group out in Vancouver.
okay,
But what they are doing to me is quite brilliant. They're partnering with existing Christian universities. So here are some of
yep,
the universities here, and they're
right,
adding to those. And what they're providing here is alternative ways of educating in various ways, including a Christian trade school alternative,
absolutely, yeah,
including the idea of work-study apprenticeships and in dual enrollment. So in high school, let's say grade 12 of a high
brilliant,
school, if you're working with them, you can get dual credit. So you can get university credit for first year university, cutting the cost and the timeline of completing your education. It is not necessary to take 4 years of university education, quite frankly. It's just not necessary. And the cost is exorbitant, and it leaves people with an extraordinary load of debt that prevents them from having children at a young age.
yeah,
And that creates downstream consequences. And the debt prevents them from ever being sovereign over their own little dominion, their house, their home. And that means that they're vulnerable to coercion
right,
and manipulation from forces that want them to co-opt and buy in. And again, I think there are ways, I think, again, from the cost perspective, from the worldview perspective, from the kingdom perspective, we have to be thinking holistically
yep,
and about the next generation. They are going to want what we are talking about and
yes,
need it, and we have to prepare it for them right now. I mean, the need's already upon us,
yes,
but it's not yet realized because the kids are not quite at that stage. But I can tell you right now that the kids that study with me at Tyndale, they're worried about how are they going to have children, because they're going to graduate with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, and how can they afford to live without both of them working
right,
full time? So how are they ever going to have the children? They're going to have to pay off their debts. Well, they're looking at not they're looking at one having to uh, leave the work force, and that means that the husband is not going to be able to go into something like pastoral ministry. He's gonna have to go over after a high paying profession. The high paying professions are largely for the corporates.
yeah, and very
And the
vulnerable.
corporates, as Jonathan just said, are so compromised that you're not going anywhere unless you compromise on that.
Yeah,
So, I mean, you have to think about it from their perspective. I just think when we get older, we lose a sense of what it must be like in that station in life and the situation. Their realities are not the same as ours.
no,
And we have not moved on from that. We are in a negative world for them right now, even if we're above and beyond that because we're
we're not as
either
vulnerable.
retired or we're wealthy enough or whatever, we're insulated from that. They are not. They're totally in that. And so if
Yeah,
they compromise, this is why they're leaving the faith.
yeah,
Christians, that the church, the church is there for you, and they think, no, it is not.
it's going to be an
It's
impediment.
not there for me at all in any way. It has no sympathy for me. It doesn't understand my situation. It tells
Right,
me it wants me to be faithful on matters of Christian integrity and so forth, but I'm going to lose my job if I don't quietly compromise. And so when they quietly compromise, then they fall into the problem I talked about of demoralization.
Very real. Very real.
Right. And then they eventually they feel they've abandoned Christ and they walk away. They feel coerced into it.
Yeah.
And they are coerced into it.
So yeah, these are certainly critical issues that need to be addressed, and we need to find each other out. I think it's encouraging that there is much already being done. We need to kind of make sure that we are aware of that and connect and develop a network that's
there's a little bit being done. I like Jonathan's optimism because I'm an optimist as well, but truthfully, there's not a lot being done.
Exactly. And
not nearly enough.
Yeah. And for sure. So there's yes, the fields are ripe, but the labor is few. We've got a big challenge ahead of us, but we need all hands on deck, all levels, all ages. And it's exciting because the culture, as you say, Scott, of death is what it is. It's a dead end culture of death. There's no joy. There's no hope in that for the future. In fact, the whole depopulation movement of the elites is
it's well advanced.
So I think we as agents, we're at God's call is a very critical juncture in the history of the church, and certainly in our nation particularly. So we do need to connect with each other and take courage, and greater that is he that is in us than he is in the world. This world system seem overwhelming, but to the eye of faith, they are extremely frail and fragile. Ultimately, that God has. But we've got to do our work. We've got to do our part, and I think.
When I started pitching, could I just say this? When I started pitching this idea around, and I talked to pastors about it,
right?
Because I served in pastoral ministry and know pastors and get to ask to speak in those contexts as well in churches and so forth. I found that I got nowhere, and I spoke to a few other people about my frustrations, businessmen mostly, and they said, "Why on earth are you talking to the pastors?" And not that they couldn't understand why, but they said, "You're never going to get anywhere with those guys. They're not they're not the people you need to speak to move this to change this situation, because they're very much in a box the way they look at things, and to some degree they're boxed in by their circumstances." And because if they don't do certain things the way they've been done, like if you take what I said about the negative world being very different than the world of 30, 40 years ago, or even 10 years ago, has the church recognized how different it is, or does it still demand of the pastors exactly what was demanded of pastors 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? And I think the answer is usually it demands what was done 30, 40, 50 years ago happen now, and nothing more and nothing less. Continue on with that, but whatever you do, do not stray off that course. And if they do, they're gonna be out on their ears. And so they're not going to move. They would feel derelict in their duty if they did, and they would probably feel that their position was at risk if they did as well.
Certainly.
So I think the movement needs to be a prophetic one outside the church, outside the establishment per se, and the churches will come on board, because when you say this to Christians, including pastors, they think that's true what you're saying. I agree with that, but I bless you, and you have my prayers, and I support you. But then when you come to them and say, well, what can you do? They say, well, I can't do anything. And I take them to be honest when they say that they can't. They're impeded by their circumstances. But if it came to them, they would get on board and they would get behind it, but they're not going to initiate it.
We need to,
with a few exceptions like Aaron Rock and Jacob Riom and and company up in Peterborough, these guys who are very special men.
Yeah, in fact, I'm hoping to have Jacob on for one of these sessions.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
And I think it is, as said, Jonathan and Scott, to support those. And I know Christina's in the midst of a lot of networks in Waterloo. There's where we need to really, build a network, learn what's being done, celebrate what's positive, but really share good success stories, learn from them. And I think, this area where we live is just there's a huge concentration of churches, immense potential.
But the
But
establishment's the
they're not.
problem, Don.
They're
The
not
establishment's the
exactly.
problem.
Yeah.
And the
So you
established
mentioned
churches are the problem. They're
exactly.
captured.
Yeah.
They're captured.
This the
If not
yes,
regulatory capture, captured
No.
by practices
exactly.
that have been hand on from generation to generation, even though the culture
Yeah.
is very different now.
Yeah. So
And
they've got to be recaptured, or at least we've got to provide alternative models. You know, maybe they're
Yeah.
dead. The dead bury the dead.
I don't think they're dead, but they're dying.
Yeah. So but I think also that, you mentioned that, like the legal profession. So there's the Christian, there's Christians involved. There's the Christian Medical Dental Association.
Christian, yeah, but they're
Some
captured.
good people, but some
Yes.
are not.
Yes.
The medical, but I mean, the conference that was held in Ottawa on the
Recently.
there's the gentleman there is the head of the Christian Medical Dental Association, a very, very excellent person. I'm going to get him as well. I think you're right to be in thinking, but the legal profession, I'm not sure if anyone's even, I have some good friends who are fairly high up in the legal profession, and this all happened.
I know the president of the Christian Legal Fellowship. I've spoken at their institutes on an annual basis for years, but there is no Christian law school. We don't have institutes like the one that Eddie was talking about. We don't have those here in Canada. And until you have those, I mean, it's just Christian lawyers sharing their faith together.
Yep.
And talking about their personal fidelity, but there's no integration of their faith with the Christian legal practice. And it's just not, there's no path there.
I know. It's really, Eddie, at some point, it may be good to have you share a bit more in depth your experience and what has really worked in, the context that we could learn from here in Canada. But I think there is an awakening. People are, the problems are so pressing in many respects, and the effects of the culture of death now in many regards is getting people's attention that we can't, the negative culture is upon us, and, there's no escape from that. But I think as Christians, we need to double down and connect with those who do see the issues and work together. And there's probably a much larger number of us than you would imagine. I
do think so. One other thing I want to say, Don, is that on our side is that the people that are against us are also against themselves.
Yes.
They're committed to they are an equal they hate everyone, including themselves. So they're going to kill themselves off as quickly as they're going to try and kill us off. They have integrity. They are totally committed to suicide and death.
Zero population. Yeah, those that hate me love death.
Yeah, that's absolutely. They really do.
So I appreciate, again, I say as many good comments and questions in the chat. I will put together and send it out to you. Eddie, make sure I have your email. Just put it in the chat. And I think I've got everyone else. Sally, I'm not sure. Sally's. Tanya, good to have you. If you want the follow-up material, just put your email in there. And I'll send that. We do, I think, really need to follow up. Jake mentioned let's really highlight some of the real successes that are at work now. I mean, that's not, let's really understand what is going well and how we can reinforce and think. Also, I think, Jonathan, you had a paper a long time ago about short-termism in the financial world, but we need to have a strategy that spans generations, a generational strategy.
Yes.
And, apply some 71 and else, but we need to be able to pass on to the coming generation a vigorous, robust Christian faith that's both exciting and, positive in many respects.
Yeah, that was speaking to what Ken was saying earlier. Like political parties have they have election strategies. They have a very short term.
Right.
Understandably, right? That they have a 5-year cycle in mind, 4-year, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But the church has the long term in goal. It must.
Yeah.
And if we do that, then politicians will be successful. And if we don't do that,
they're going to be banging their heads. Yeah.
They got no chance.
Yeah. And that's where I think that there's been a very defective eschatology pervasive within the broadly evangelical church, that basically things are bad. They're going to get worse. Let's hang in, be faithful, but Christ is going to come and fix this. But where our responsibility lies, is that really when he said all power is given to you, make disciples of nations? All the Psalms, talk about all nations coming to the Lord and worship and that's to be in our time. This is on our watch as Christians. We really need to bring up a new generation. Any study of the Old Testament would be encouraging here as well, just how things work.
For sure.
But I know there's a lot of other good comments and insights.
Any other questions or comments? Or
let's leave it open. Yes, please. And say, well, we'll certainly have a follow-up. And I'll go through the questions that were raised and also look at an additional session, maybe with Christina. Christina is a great organizer. Maybe we'll organize something.
Oh, good.
To get the right people in the right room. Go ahead.
Scott, can you kind of summarize, what can we be doing? I know you've kind of said it already, but just sort of put it together. I'm a slow learner. Sorry.
Hey, George, I appreciate that.
I don't think you're slow at all, George.
No.
But there needs to be a long-term view at the field of education, which is a beachhead for the advancement of the kingdom of God in Canada. And that will include not just the stages that we consider people to be children, but will also include early adulthood, putting them into the employment field. And make sure that they don't fall prey to the regulatory capture that will go along the way, because there are dangers when you're in your 20s and you're trying to advance in your career that are just as real as when you're in your teens and are being given, sexual devices, condoms, whatever, all that, and that. But the compromise you're going to make in the corporate world is just as real to your faith. It's just as real. So thinking from the big picture as adults that have got beyond that and are established or retired, have to think, what are those hurdles going to be, and how do we create a path so that they don't have to compromise in order to live in this world? How are we going to do that? We're going to make bridges, connect people so that they can flourish and that their situation will be better than our situation is, because at present it just gets worse and worse. And that in part is because nobody's stepping back and saying, how do we actually fix this problem? From a big, when I say the church perspective, I mean all Christians. How do we do it for all Christians, not just for my family? That's the university perspective. That's the big picture the big picture. But how does it come? It's not going to come on a national scale. It has to come at the local level with local families, local churches, local businesses, local regulatory bodies and so forth, so that somebody in my community is going to hire my son because they're going to say, I know his father and I know that he's a good kid and he's going to work well for me, and he's not going to, spring some diversity trap on me and cause me to bring my company down, and he's going to work hard and we're going to be on the same page.
Right.
Every Christian employer wants employees like that. Absolutely. You have to make those connections early on and all through. So then they're not going to have to leave your house and move to another side of the country just to get a job. Right? They should be able to stay where you are and build a family legacy. That family needs to be seen, I think, as an intergenerational thing as well. I also think the family's a broken thing. Never mind divorcees. I'm talking about even holding intergenerational families together so that they can pass on their wealth and wisdom and hold the whole family in the same community. That's how you transform a culture.
Renn talks about the problem of singleness now. That singleness meant
huge
people
problem.
Just not marrying. They're not marrying. And so huge. I think definitely, certainly a follow up and next steps. I mean, we span Canada from West Coast to Central Canada. Got Eddie in I guess it was Tennessee.
Tennessee.
So put your email in. I'll send the chat notes. Probably view that and probably have a follow-up session. But I do want to have Jacob from Trinity Bible Chapel on for a session in terms of what they've really learned and what's worked. And I think would be, and also I think Nick Ellis as well. I think if we did sort of reached out to all the key people we know and said, look, we're going to have a further discussion, I think Nick would
Well,
be
what Nick
pretty-
will do, Don, is he will put flesh on the bones there's a structure there. And if you agree with
Absolutely.
what this, so then Christian Halls, and Nick and I correspond regularly. And I'm going to start a Christian grad school here, by the way.
All right. I'll enroll. Thank you.
We're talking tomorrow
Okay.
about doing that. We'll
Yeah.
start we'll start those things going here, but he will be able to give you a sense of how to implement that
Absolutely.
right away in the
Yeah.
local community, which I think is very credible. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Christina, did you have your hand up or?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that we are having Ann Gillies in
Oh,
for,
great.
for peer attachment versus parental
yeah.
attachment in education in Waterloo. We're hoping for April 20th, but haven't
Okay.
solidified the date and the location. Really, it's just the location that we need to be able to.
Okay. We'll definitely get the word out on that one.
And
Ann's
then
going to be
honing
a
in on
guest.
how to for homeschooling in pods for those
Okay.
families. Yeah.
We're
Scott,
bringing
can I
the right people
support
together.
what you were saying about intergenerational family. It's chapter 17 of Genesis where God speaks to Abraham. You probably know which passage I'm going to be talking about, but he says that, you know, I am going to tell him this about what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah because he is going to bless the world by passing on his faith to his children. And in Deuteronomy, it not only tells us to pass them on to our children, but also to our children's
children.
And in fact, the key to blessing the whole world is that there will be a people who pass on their faith in God, not only to their children, but to their children's children's. Grandparents need to be woken up. And my guess is that they are probably one of the big keys to getting activity happening because God has given grandparents far more insight into what's happening to their grandchildren than
I think you're right.
Yeah, they can see where the parents are just too busy coping, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also they probably could support the kids going to a Christian school or
if not financially, they could help with looking after various things. Absolutely. Like
that's where you need to be in community as well. At least, you know, there is a real, you're not just scattered all over the place.
But they don't believe it's their responsibility. Well, it's my kids' responsibility to bring up their own kids.
Yeah.
And if we can get these kind of teachings
that's a different talk. I can give you a talk on that as well.
Well, probably.
Oh, yeah.
The trustee family versus the nuclear family, which is already a travesty. The idea that the family is just the parents and the kids.
Yeah.
That is not the biblical family.
I did an essay the family in history. That was 40 years ago, but traced all those. It's important, very important. Well, look, thank you for your time, everyone. Last call, if you wanted to comment or say anything, and certainly, I know that our other Scott Jacobson, is here, a local pastor, and Scott, I'm sure you've got some keen insights. I saw Scott had put some comments in the chat, and we'll pick those up as well. It's glad you could join us, Scott. I don't know, Scott Jacobson, if you have any comments just from what you've listened to and being a pastor here in Hamilton that you might want to share. Put you on the spot, mind you. We got you, Scott.
You might have walked away, Don.
Okay, I say we're not.
Tell.
Yeah, that's true. All right, we'll get him. I'll get him next time. But Scott's a great fellow here too.
Yes,
pastor. So
yeah, I hold him in high regard.
So we'll definitely want to follow this up, and I will probably talk with Christine about just because the network has been developing in this area on a number of levels.
He's here.
And Scott, you are there? Oh, good. I'm going to give you the final word to you, Scott Jacobson. But no sound.
He can't speak. Doesn't mean he's not there. So there you go.
Well, you're in spirit. So again, make sure you got your email. And Christina, you and I should probably talk because we've been involved in common events. But let's put it all together for the next stage. And I think Nick Ellis, as well as Scott and others, Jacob, would be great resources. And let's, I think we could have a large gathering that could be very much inspired by this work and what's being done. And the old saying was to prod a slumbering giant, but the Christian
Okay, well, Dave and Illa, do you want me to answer this briefly?
Oh, where is it? I'm sorry.
Well, it just came up about evolutionary theory and believing in this.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I think evolutionary theory is the most errant nonsense ever invented. It's totally anti-intellectual. It lacks evidence. It lacks, I mean, don't get me going on that.
Man after my own heart, but yes.
Yeah, it's such nonsense. And it's just group coercion and the sort of stuff that they did in COVID, like trust the science and all that. And it's such nonsense. Anyway, but classical education has nothing to do with belief in Greek and Roman methodology. It is a method of educating that will use the classics for sure, but it doesn't encourage people to believe in the Greek gods. It suggests that the Greeks believed in Greek gods and we don't. And how different, and thank God for that, but how different is the world because of the transformation of education that took place under Christians, because the classical method was carried on by Christians. And we still call it the classical method because it started in the classical age, but it was transformed by Christians and improved by Christians, dare I say it. Because at the center of Christian education is Christ. And Christian virtues are then taught in classical education now. It's not classical in the same sense as 2,000 years ago. It has changed.
Yeah, and I'm getting the understanding of that, but where I see like the prophecies in Daniel say these empires will have been, and they have been, they're no longer are. And I think that's hence why we get the second coming of Christ in the Christian mind. So so it doesn't go the classical route. It says, oh, that's done. So what's coming?
Well, so in Daniel 7, where it talks about that, and is obviously picked up in Book of Revelation, and even in the talk about the Son of Man. I have a colleague whose whole doctoral thesis and research is on the Son of Man as it's used in Scripture. I do think those ages are gone, but what has come fulfills everything that was promised and spoken of in those eras. And it's not that everything's gone from it. So the general postulate of the church in terms of learning of pagan cultures is that we eat the meat and spit out the bones, or to put it in a more biblical way, we plunder the Egyptians. And we take the goodness of those cultures and we recalibrate it, we translate it into for Christian purposes. So the gold that was used to worship idols in Egypt is used to adorn the temple and used for the worship of the one God. And that's what but you can use pagan truth, and because it is truth, but it needs to be directed in the right way. And that's what Christians effectively have done to classical education over the generations. And I don't think that it is going back to the past. It's using the past and the meaning of the past, because the God of the Bible is the God of history. He was the God of history back then, and he's still the God of history, but history can teach us something. We can learn from the past.
Excellent. I just see
Sally.
Make any sense?
It's like you're saying Christ is a redeemer.
Yes. Yes.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yes, and he redeems all culture.
Okay.
I just see Sally, which I guess you're John Patrick's wife then, if I'm not
She is indeed.
That John Patrick would be available to speak.
Yeah, John's a great speaker. He
I'm
speaks
line
in particular. He's a medical doctor, if you don't know, and he's really great on all sorts of bioethical issues and other issues in general, because he was the president of Augustine College for over a decade and great in this area.
No, indeed. So Sally, I had the pleasure of having lunch with John and Sally back in the spring with Michelle when I was driving. It's a wonderful couple and a great resource there. So yes, tell John I will be emailing him and lining him up. So other comments then? I think we've had a very valuable discussion. And we pray God's blessing on all of this, and that God will indeed bless the work of our hands, that it will be established. And Psalm 90. And we do. I mean, we are a community of faith and community of hope. Our expectation is indeed that God's truth will overcome the darkness, and we have much to look forward to, or at least point forward to, for our children and their grandchildren. A glorious hope. We really, it seems to be, the Christian community properly constituted and developed is a community of hope, and we have a great, many great gifts to share to those around us. So no excuse for being idle or sitting on the sidelines here. Again, Scott, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For the passion and insights that you bring together, and we'll certainly want to follow up with
Great.
your conversation. Well,